Okay, great. So I just started the recording and we will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Odisi. I am from NASA BOCES and I'm here with Nancy Lynn. And we are both program specialists, professional developers, and we are happy to be with you today on the topic of scaffolding for ELLs in distance learning or hybrid settings. Today's session, as well as all sessions that are marked with a TRLE, that acronym, are connected as part of a grant. So this grant that we are working together as a part of was funded by the U.S. Department of Education in response to the shift that educators needed to make due to COVID and due to having to shift to remote and hybrid teaching. So throughout the state, different BOCES have come together to create resources, and then other BOCES are then turnkeying those resources. So our role here at NASA BOCES is to turnkey these resources to you. So Nancy and I attend a lot of trainings. We get great resources to then share with you. And we've come together, these BOCES have come together across New York State, and they've branded themselves as eTeach New York. So there is a dedicated website that houses a lot of additional resources as well, eteachnewyork.org. And together, we're just coming together to support this initiative and to support this grant, this Teaching in Remote and Hybrid Learning Environments grant. And all of these sessions are completely free. So please come to one, come to all, share with colleagues, share with friends, open to all educators, just again, for the sole purpose of supporting educators during this time. And although today's session is focusing on ELLs, we are supporting 5 additional areas as well: students with disabilities, families as partners, culturally responsive education, ELLs, shifting to online learning, as well as social emotional learning. So those are all of the areas that we are providing support in as part of this grant. And each of those core areas, there are 6 sessions that come along with each of them. And if you're looking on my learning plan, you can always search for just the letters TRLE, and that'll yield for you everything that is associated as part of this grant. Okay, so now we'll get started with the focus of today. So we are going to be talking about scaffolds for our ELLs, and we're going to be really thinking about it in these 4 different areas. We're going to first describe the challenges and opportunities for ELLs during distance and hybrid learning that we've observed. Then we're going to define what scaffolds are. Then we're going to explore different strategies for scaffolding, specifically during remote and hybrid learning. And then we are going to apply a 5-step framework to scaffold content instruction for ELLs in distance and hybrid learning environments. Okay, so these are the areas that we're going to be focusing on as we are going through this presentation. So to begin, there is a whole Padlet with resources that have been created for you. So I'm going to jump out just to show you what is there, and I'm going to drop this link in the chat for you. Some of these tools, we're not going to be referencing all of them today, but some of them we will be as we go throughout the presentation. Specifically in this first column, there are tools that have been curated for you here. It's kind of referenced as a toolbox, and they are listed in order. So there's tool 1, tool 2, tool 3, and in this Padlet, just by scrolling down, I just hover my mouse, and as I scroll down, it shows me all of the tools and resources that are here. And then there's also additional columns here as well. So there's scaffolding resources and examples, and some of later in the presentation, Nancy's going to be walking us through a lot of these resources. So some of them you might find linked here as well. And then there's additional articles, additional resources, and then, specific headings as well. So wanting to support our ELLs social emotionally. And then if we come to the right, this is meant as an open space. So if you within your district, if you have created some great plans, or if you have come across some great resources and you'd like to share them here, we're all better when we come and we share together. So you can always feel free to just press that plus sign and you can add something. So this Padlet's completely open for you to add to as well. And again, ultimately, it does benefit from all of us kind of coming together and sharing. Let me know if you have any problems accessing this link. But we are going to be referencing as we go through the presentation. Specifically, we're going to be referencing a lot of these tools in this first column. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we are going to be referencing the tools packet as well as the Padlet. as well as we're going to have a couple times to kind of stop and think. So just look out for these icons, and that's what they mean. So this is an additional Padlet that was created. So the people who created these resources for this presentation today, they have a whole website full of resources. So just to kind of share with you as well, we always like as many resources as we can get, right? So this is their website is Support Ed, and they have additional resources here. So a whole other Padlet here supporting ELLs in 2020 and 2021. So this one has even more resources for you. Okay. So a lot of these resources and the framework that was developed for today was really drawn from this text, Unlocking English Learners' Potential. And today we are really focusing on, again, this area of scaffolding. So this text, if this is something that is, you're looking for more support in, and you're looking for, more ways to support your ELLs, this would be a great text to get for yourself. And notice it covers all of these additional topics as well. But again, the presentation for today is really focusing on this third chapter that's coming from this book, and the area of scaffolding instruction for ELLs. So we're going to start off just with kind of a conversation about the challenges and the opportunities that ELLs have maybe been awarded during distance or hybrid learning. Because I know we often focus on the negative, that has come out of this year and that has come out of this extremely, no two ways about it, challenging situation. But it's also nice to kind of look for those bright spots and look for the maybe, hidden kind of opportunities that were awarded to our students. So just take a moment and think for yourself, maybe what challenges have you seen your ELLs face during this time? And again, on the other side of it, let's think about maybe some opportunities, some bright spots, maybe some success stories that you've seen during this time as well. And if you want to type in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that's completely up to you. Trying to work on my wait time.
Well, one of the resources that I'll be talking about later as a part of a scaffold is, for example, like if using Google Jamboard, we could have student groupings where maybe the ELLs are grouped together and then they can collaborate online more easily.
Yeah, I was going to echo that, Nancy. I think that the more heavy use of technology has kind of enabled more collaboration opportunities and more chances for students to share their voice, whereas they might have been more shy in class, or reserved to kind of share and collaborate and speak out. With the addition of a tool like Jamboard and just with technology, it gives students the ability to participate more. So I think that has been maybe a bright spot for sure. Okay, so Christina said she's noticed some of the students being able to work better independently. I agree. I think that for certain students, the pacing has been a little bit easier for them to kind of be able to go back to have, again, maybe more access to tangible resources, specifically in the online environment, where they're able to maybe reference more materials easily, go back, maybe leaning on more videos and things like that, where they're able to maybe rewind and take things at their own pace as well. So Beth has been in person all year. Okay, Beth. And, as we're going through this presentation today, Beth, the goal is obviously this whole initiative was to support remote and hybrid teaching, but there's lots of just kind of universal best practices and universal tools that you're going to be able to lean on. And Christina said they're able to complete more assignments independently than they were able to this time last year. That's great. Oh, excellent. Yeah, I like to really there's no denying that the challenges that teachers and students and administrators, everybody has faced, but it's nice to reflect upon those little bright spots. So I'm glad that we were able to identify some of those. So, and we can speak through, let's take a minute to really identify and talk through some of these challenges that all of our students are facing, but specifically our vulnerable populations, right? Our students with disabilities and our ELLs. So this first challenge that we can speak to is the inequity around technology. So, home to home, not everybody has access to high quality internet. I know that most districts purchase those devices for students. So most districts have that one-to-one initiative for their students, but there's still, challenges in that area as well. There's been privacy concerns. So, students reluctant to turn their cameras on. Again, speaking of inequity, not every student has a dedicated learning space with, a beautiful background that they're able to share, or even a quiet space to work in. They might have family members walking in and out, younger siblings. It might be a busy, kind of hectic place that they're learning in. There's been increased pressure on families. So families have had to take on a much more active role with their students' education, taking on, some of them taking on a almost a teacher role in the home, whereas others, again, speaking of inequity, other family members might have had to work from home, might have, not have been able to be home at all, had to go to work. So there's lots of inequities in that area as well. There's been, for sure trauma, especially in light of COVID. It has impacted different families in different ways. Stress on educators. So of course, the lots of educators, this was an extremely challenging situation for them, regardless of the environment, teachers having to live stream, having to do that concurrent model, teaching children in the classroom face to face, as well as reaching students remotely, or just reaching students remotely, or even the people who were in person. It's completely different protocols that are in place. All the ways that we may have done, group work and just all of the routines that we might have had established have definitely had to been tweaked as well. Shifts in models and routines, that's kind of what I was just referencing as well. And especially for our ELLs, there might have been insufficient opportunities for language use. So especially if those ELLs have been remote, if you're thinking about a typical face-to-face school day, there's lots more opportunities for ELLs to use both social and academic language. So those are just natural opportunities that arise throughout the day. So that those might not have occurred as easily or as naturally in a remote environment. And finally, the lack of scaffolding for content instruction. So again, as educators were facing this challenge to shift to this remote environment, that might have been something that is not necessarily been on their radar. They're just trying to kind of like make it and, do the best that they can to get the content to their students, and differentiating or providing those scaffolds maybe was not something that was, high on their list of priorities, where they were just trying to kind of like transition to, bringing all of their resources online. So these are just some of the selected challenges. Again, I'm sure we could speak to more, but just to give us a few. But now thinking about these selected opportunities. So again, looking at the flip side, looking at some of the positive of this time, students have had valuable time with their families, so a lot more together time. Lots more opportunity for home language use. So, having that strong foundation in a student's home language, it's evidence-based that it then promotes in the acquisition of a second language. So there's been lots more opportunities for the students to use their home language, which therefore will then help to aid them in the acquisition of their second language. There's been more opportunities for collaboration amongst teachers, and as we were kind of mentioning a few minutes ago, that Nancy was mentioning as well, for students to collaborate with each other in kind of lower stakes environments. There's been new and different learning opportunities. So lots of teachers are finding new and creative ways to engage with their students. Again, maybe utilizing new technology tools. And there's been this element of flexibility that has been added, and that has kind of opened up doorways to, new ways of teaching, new ways of learning, and new ways of reaching our students. And additionally, specifically for our ELLs, they've had the opportunity to, have more repetition of language, especially if teachers are relying on maybe more recordings, videos, maybe recording lessons, where they're kind of walking students through slideshows or PowerPoints. The students are able to then kind of rewind, listen to the teacher again, or rewind, go back and hear a specific sentence again. It's giving them kind of at their own pace the opportunity to engage with the language with the timing that they need without feeling kind of to be rushed with the rest of the class or without feeling like any embarrassment. So these are just some selected opportunities. So any of these surprise you or anything that we kind of just mentioned, are you thinking that you can build upon? I think for me at least, I just didn't necessarily think about the repetition of language opportunities that ELLs have been afforded, as a result of engaging with their content in, in a more, you know, um, it's in more of a technology environment, again, like relying on videos, giving the opportunity for our L's to take time, rewind, repeat, slow it down. That was something that totally make I know Beth is saying that makes a lot of sense, and I agree. It's just one of those things, one of those bright spots that didn't necessarily occur to me until we were working on this presentation. Okay, so now we're going to jump into kind of the meat of this presentation, which is really thinking about the scaffolds for RLs. But first, let's make sure we have a nice clear definition so that we can work off of that as we are moving forward. So to you, what is your definition of scaffolds? What do you think that their intention is, and how do they work? And this is a term I know that many of us, as we were, becoming educators, I think back to like Vygotsky and Piaget and all of those kind of early names in my educational career or in my educational education. So thinking back and just in your day to day, what are you what's your definition of scaffolds? Christina said, utilizing previous knowledge to build on. Christina, that's a great example of a scaffold for sure, right? And that's one that definitely is beneficial for ELLs. And as we are moving through our presentation, I'm sure Nancy's going to reference that. So that is for sure, one example of a scaffold. Great. Well, let's get into it and let's kind of make our universal definition, and especially specifically as we're thinking of scaffolds for our ELLs. So what are they and what are they intended to do? How can they be used to support our ELLs? So when we're thinking about using scaffolds for our ELLs, we really want to make sure that we think about it and even look at this picture, right? Those are scaffolds that we might see when people are working on a building. And think of it as the fact that they're there to kind of complete a specific purpose and task, and then they're taken away. So really, when we're thinking about scaffolds, we want to think of them as temporary supports. So this is not something that's meant to be long-term for the life of, for the life of an L. It's definitely, accomplishing, helping them to accomplish and to meet, those standards and those goals that we might have for a lesson, but they are intended to be temporary. They are intended to be slowly taken away. And facilitating students, the goal is that ultimately we want them to be able to complete these tasks independently in the future. So again, it's leading towards that kind of gradual release where we're here to support them. We're giving them what they need to access and to make sense of the content that we are sharing with them. But eventually we do want to slowly, pull back on that as well. So they support a student in being able to perform a task that they couldn't do without help. And the ultimate goal is, again, to facilitate those students to be able to complete that same type of task independently in the future once they've acquired more language and more skills related to the task. So it's not meant to be a permanent support. And as we're thinking about our different ELLs at their different levels, entering, emerging, transitioning, expanding, all those different levels, it's not just one universal scaffold that we're applying for all of our ELLs. A student who is commanding, the types of scaffolds and supports that we are providing that student are going to look much different than our entering students, right? Our entering students are going to need a lot more support, a lot more of those, that ladder pieces to help them reach the content, where our commanding students, they might only need, a little bit of support. So it looks different for a different population of students. And again, eventually we want them to be able to do that same task with those scaffolds removed. So why are we going to use our scaffolds or with ELLs? Why is it important to use that? First of all, we want to help them to make comprehensible input. And this is Nancy and I in an earlier ELLs presentation, we were looking at the work of Krashen, and really that's just helping students to kind of make sense of the content, make sense of the lesson that they are, that the teacher is teaching them and the work that they are kind of grappling with. We want them to get the gist. We want them to understand, what it is we're trying to teach them. We also want to help make rigorous grade level curriculum and assessments accessible to ELLs. So these academic texts and concepts, they can be broken down into meaningful pieces. And when they're presented with key instructional supports and scaffolds, those are then kind of the bridge to help the students to be able to access that grade level material and that grade level content. We also want to provide lots of opportunities to model language for our students. So we want to make sure that they are, hearing from us, hearing from their peers, as well as where they are able to practice the language as well. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not, when we're using scaffolds, it's not this kind of one size fits all approach. It's not like you have the label of L, that means you're all getting a fully translated version of this text. That's not the intent and purpose of these different scaffolds. It needs to be specifically chosen considering what's the level of this student, what type of support do they need, and how is this going to help them access that content, with, again, keeping in mind, eventually we want to be able to remove this. So we're making sure that we're differentiating by their proficiency level, as well as their home language literacy. Again, just with the example of providing a fully translated text for a student, they might not know how to read in their home language. So taking that into consideration as well as additional specific factors to each of your ELLs. Okay, so let's think for a moment, and a couple of questions here, but just kind of thoughts that come from these prompts. So what factors do you take into consideration when you're selecting your appropriate scaffolds for ELLs? What are some scaffolds that you found work best in your classroom? And how are you differentiating to meet the needs of your different ELLs and of their different proficiency levels? So any thoughts that come to mind? And you can type in the chat or unmute. And I know, Sharon, you just joined us. I put in the chat access to this presentation. So welcome. So anything that kind of emerged maybe this year as a scaffold that, you leaned on often for some of your students, or different types that you found works for, your different levels of students. I know for like entering and emerging students, if students are just coming to the country, and kind of jumping into grade level content, it's always great to rely on their home language as a scaffold and support. So finding translated resources for your students, translated videos. We shared in earlier sessions, resources like Khan Academy, that they have dedicated kind of translated videos on grade level content and topics. So high school, Algebra 1 content and concepts, where they can be a part of your Algebra 1 classroom, but then you can also provide them the home language support of accessing it in their home language. But again, I would not give that same scaffold to my commanding students. Anybody have anything to share? Okay, well, let's keep going. And if you're not sure of maybe some scaffolds that are, appropriate for ELLs, or maybe this is all new to you, then that's when Nancy is kind of taking over. She's going to give us lots of different examples of scaffolds. So don't worry. So this first tool that we have here is accessible again in that Padlet that I shared previously, but I also do have it linked here as well as a Google Doc. So I'll put this in the chat for you. And what this is intended to do is actually to kind of reflect upon this conversation moving forward, the different types of scaffolds that you may or may not be aware of, again, that Nancy's going to walk us through in a few minutes. And just kind of reflecting for yourself, am I familiar with this? Is this something maybe I'm familiar with, but I don't really use? Or is this something that I do use all the time? And it's really just meant for you to build your awareness of the different types of scaffolds that are available to you, as well as just thinking through as we're moving forward and as we are sharing the different types of scaffolds that you might use with your students. You can always kind of think through, all right, this might be one that would work for this type of lesson, or this might be a scaffold that would be helpful for, my kind of transitioning students. Thinking through again, the different scaffolds for the different needs of your students, their proficiency levels, as well as just the content that you're trying to teach your students as well. So it's just meant as a kind of self-reflection, self-assessment tool. And if you're an administrator, this might be something that you can share, with your teachers, or just kind of to reflect upon in your observations. Is this something that you're seeing in classrooms? If not, then it might be worthy to explore with your teachers. And again, I keep referencing our previous presentations, but we really have to think through the mindset that you might not have an L certification, or you know, you're not designated as an L teacher, but we are all teachers of ELLs. We all service ELLs. So all of this applies and is best practices to our teaching as we support our students. So thinking through these different types of scaffolds, and again, they were mentioned in that that kind of self-reflection tool that I shared, but we can break them down really into these three main areas. So we're going to explore each of these again as we move forward, but they can be considered materials, they can be instructional scaffolds, and they can be intentional student grouping scaffolds. So here's just some examples from what each of those areas looks like. So for materials and resources, here's some examples: graphic organizers, sentence frames, home language materials. Instructional scaffolds could be pre-teaching, pre-identifying vocabulary, background knowledge. I know that Christina mentioned that earlier. Student grouping. Oops, sorry. Again, intentional. I'm intentionally pairing a language model with my L to, to provide more opportunities for the student to hear language as well as to produce language. So again, just kind of reflecting now for a moment, maybe just either for yourself in your own classroom or again from an administrative standpoint, which category do you either use the most or do you see the most in your building? And then again, thinking of this kind of remote and hybrid slant, maybe how has that changed due to a shift in delivery having to be in a remote or hybrid environment? I feel like typically most that either I've had experience with or that I've observed and seen has been more in the materials and resources section. I feel like that's kind of the one that most people go to most frequently. Get, here's a tool for you to help support you to access this content. Again, providing a graphic organizer, providing sentence frames, providing word banks. Those are, I feel, popular ones that I've seen, as well as student grouping, often, kind of providing more small group support, one-on-one support. Christina says she agrees that that helps them the most, definitely. Student grouping with modeling, yeah. So taking the time to, work closely with those students to help, give them that extra time, to, grapple with the content with supports, and it could be with material support. So it could be that a teacher's there, so that's the student grouping, and then the teacher is giving them a material to work on. So that could be, incorporating two of those three types of scaffolds, again, all depending on the level of our students. Okay, so this was kind of the introduction to the types of scaffolds, as well as just kind of generating a shared definition of what scaffolds are and why we would use them in our classroom with our ELLs. I'm going to pass it over to Nancy, and Nancy's going to bring us through actual samples and examples of different types of scaffolds that we can utilize in our classes.
Katie, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, well, I will allow you to share right now. Okay, you should be able to now.
Okay, great. Yes. Are you seeing the slide properly?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So now I'm going to explore each of these three categories of scaffolding and provide examples of each that you can use in distance or hybrid learning with ELLs. So the first category of scaffolds I'd like to talk about are instructional materials. These are things that help develop and support ELLs engagement of understanding. Some examples of materials that can be used as scaffolds include what you see in the green bullets on this slide. And now let's take a look at each of these material scaffolds more specifically. Sorry, I just have to move my Zoom toolbars out of the way to advance this slide. Okay, so word banks offer vocabulary to support ELLs in completing a particular task. So for example, students may use a word bank to complete sentence frames about text. They might use a word bank in responding orally to questions in distance and hybrid learning. And you can also create drag and drop word banks to be used in sentence frames and paragraph frames using tech tools such as Google Jamboard. I'm just curious, how many of you do use Google Jamboard, or if you're an administrator, you see your teachers using that? It's a great way to get all the students active and sharing on the same Jamboard, whether in small groups or whole class.
And there's other tools like Jamboard too, if you're not a Google district, like Padlet, There's Flipgrid and Pear Deck and Nearpod. Those are other ways too that can get all the voices of the students without them, feeling shy or feeling embarrassed. It's just gives everybody the opportunity to share their voice.
Okay, so another example would be a virtual word wall, and word walls are most often seen at elementary level, but they are useful at the upper grade levels as well. At elementary level, word walls generally include sight words or high frequency words and words that don't follow standard patterns like spelling and things like that. But walls can also be developed for unit vocabulary at the upper grades. So for ELLs, walls might include academic words, transition and signal words for writing, content words for the unit of study. And really at all levels, students and teachers, it's beneficial to co-create the word wall. And word walls can include visuals and translations of the words in students' home languages to be of best support for ELLs. So one opportunity for word walls specifically in distance and hybrid learning is including recordings of the words for students to reference as needed. Katie, did you want to mention anything about?
Oh yeah, so I just put in the chat for everyone this website. It's linked on the bottom left. Miss Park, she is an ELL educator who has a dedicated space where she shares access to resources that she's created and templates that she's created. So I would definitely recommend share it with your teachers, or again, if you're a teacher yourself, to kind of check it out. They're all just linked to copies of Google Slides that are then completely editable for you. So there's a lot of nice templates and resources there that you can then tweak to make your own. And this virtual word wall template that's on this slide, I will drop access to that in the chat as well, because then you can just make your own copy and you can edit it for the words that your students need for an upcoming unit, or depending on your needs.
So yes, particularly for ELL teachers, it'll be worth their time to check out this website, the Ms. Park's website, because again, all of her resources she shares there are free, and it would spare them to create the wheel from scratch. They can just modify what she has or just use it directly.
And I love just one more thing about that is the audio is embedded. So it's not just then them looking at a word, looking at a picture, it's providing an additional level of support so they can hear the word, see a picture representation. So it's really just, giving them as much support as possible.
So another example of material support is something called paragraph frames. So paragraph frames provide student support with extended discourse. So when you're getting more in depth with the text. The amount of support varies, but often includes language for organizing a paragraph. So they can see the structure for how they could write a paragraph more independently on their own later. So teachers can provide paragraph frames that provide more support for language at the beginning of the essay, and then gradually decrease the amount of language provided in the paragraph support. In this example, you can see that the teacher has also provided clues as to what the students need to do in completing the frame. So for example, insert a literary device. The idea is that students gain familiarity with the structure and language used in constructing a paragraph, and then they will need less support from there on out. So when completing a paragraph frame, ELLs may also benefit from a graphic organizer that helps them clarify their ideas and find evidence to support their ideas. Another material support is the use of bilingual glossary. This example includes definitions, pictures, examples, and whether or not the word is a cognate, meaning it has a similar sounding word in the English language. It's important to have an understanding of ELLs home language literacy skills when planning for the support. ELLs with literacy skills in their home language will benefit greatly from this kind of bilingual glossary support.
I'm just putting in the chat that Steinhardt NYU bilingual glossaries and content I'm sorry, and Cognate resource that we've shared in previous sessions, because it does have it listed in multiple languages, and those are approved glossaries that can be used, for students when they're taking state assessments. And it does have specific content area glossaries, including elementary math, middle school math, algebra, geometry, science. So that's something else to explore.
And research has shown the benefit of providing ELLs who are fluent in their home language with supporting materials in that language, their home language, the bilingual glossaries. Research has proven to be beneficial. And teachers can provide these types of resources even when the teacher does not speak the home language. So, for example, a teacher can provide ELLs with books, articles, or websites that can support their understanding of a particular content area. And teachers can also work with a native speaker of the student's home language to develop a short text or video to provide background knowledge on a topic. It can also benefit ELLs of lower proficiency levels in their home language to demonstrate understanding of content in their home language, even if they're not that strong in their home language as well. So International Children's Digital Library website has a selection of digital books in 59 different languages. And you can also use this website to explore books from around the world. Then the other link, Unite for Literacy, has text in Spanish and includes a read aloud feature. And again, these links are all included on this slide. Scaffolds that fall into the instructional category are things that teacher can do to support ELLs in working with understanding the material. So for example, the pre-teaching of key vocabulary is a scaffold that will help students understand a new text. Vocabulary can be taught and practiced with the use of visuals, student-friendly definitions, and examples and non-examples. Teachers can also concisely teach background knowledge that ELLs may need in order to engage with the text or a new concept. And I'll be talking more about this in an upcoming slide. Additionally, ELLs, as well as many other students, also benefit from clear modeling of a task. They benefit from the repetition of key ideas and concepts, especially when they have an opportunity to practice their understanding of content in varied ways. So it's important to remember that when giving directions, ELLs benefit from seeing the directions, hearing directions, and having the directions restated by themselves or another student to make sure they fully understand it. One instructional scaffold is the concise instruction of background knowledge. So while providing essential background knowledge is important to ELLs' engagement and understanding of text, it's also important to not provide too much background information and focus on only the background knowledge that's essential to ELLs' current understanding. So in other words, just in terms of using time, pre-teach only the essential information to then get them ready to explore the new content. So this slide here shows an example of Mississippi River with text students will read about a man who helped clean up the Mississippi River. And a short text was developed to provide necessary information. And the background actually includes a short text and glossary, a map, and a video about Mississippi River. And background knowledge should include visuals or simple language. It can be done as a homework task or a do now activity. Modeling is an essential scaffold for ELLs. It involves the teacher or another student demonstrating a new concept or approach to learning, and students learning by observing. So teachers can model behaviors, language, thinking, or steps in an activity. And this checklist that you see on this slide provides an example of strategies that can be modeled for students. So students can use the checklist to listen for other students using specific strategies or recognizing them when they use a particular strategy. So before introducing a checklist like this, it could be beneficial to present each strategy independently along with opportunities for students to practice. So for example, you might begin with predicting. And for hybrid and distance learning, you could record a video or audio of a think aloud for students to reference. So that would be a model. So finally, student grouping is a third type of scaffold. So pair work can be effective as a scaffold when carefully structured. Teachers should intentionally pair students together. For example, a teacher might pair ELLs with the same home language to work together, and therefore bringing the home language support the teacher may not be able to provide. And alternatively, the teacher could create mixed ability or language proficiency pairings in which one student is providing additional support to the other. And it's important to change up the pairings because both to keep the student interested, but also give every student an opportunity to demonstrate their strengths. Small group work can also be an effective scaffold in order for groups to work efficiently. ELLs need structured activities, preparation for group work, and intentional groupings. So the activities should be designed to provide positive interdependence, equal participation with specific roles and duties for each group member, and individual accountability. So ELLs will need practice in communicating their ideas, listening, and resolving differences. And small group work can also be a time for the teacher to provide directed support to a group with similar strengths and needs. So student grouping is a challenging type of scaffold to use during distance and hybrid learning, but it's essential to find ways to provide the scaffold for ELLs. So here are some suggestions for how you can do this during distance learning. One suggestion would be use shared writing documents. This can be done with various online tools like Google Docs or Google Slides. Another is the use of breakout rooms. It's important that you provide students with clear roles and instructions for their time to be spent in breakout rooms. And for older students, you can also create pair assignments in which you ask students to meet virtually. You could also ask students to record their responses to certain questions and then comment on each other's responses using tools such as Flipgrid or Padlet. And another idea might be to pair students as pen pals and have them write back and forth to each other on a particular topic. Any of you use any of these tools, or if you're an administrator, have seen your teachers use any of these shared docs or breakout rooms, and anything you want to, any information about that you want to share?
I know, just to give, a real world example, my husband is an ENL teacher and he uses Flipgrid with his students, and he just raves about um, how effective it is with his students, getting them to, again, practice language, getting them to then respond to their peers' videos as well. So it just gives lots of opportunities for students to practice language.
And also to engage them at a higher level. So we know from Vygotsky that all learning is social. And so, to have students collaborating while they're learning is highly effective for their retention of learning. Okay, so again, you'll see here linked is Ms. Park's resources. So this slide is a great example of providing students with specific roles when using breakout rooms specifically. And again, this resource comes from the teacher, Esther Park, who is a teacher of ELLs. Again, the link, I believe, Katie, you provided that already in the chat. Yes, okay. So I'd like now to just take a moment to stop and think about which strategies or tools you use or would like to use to support student collaboration during distance or hybrid learning. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share or type in chat your thoughts. And then I'll continue. Okay, so now that we've explored categories of scaffolds, we'll describe strategies for planning scaffolded lessons for ELLs. So this is our 5-step framework to scaffold content instruction for ELLs in a distance or hybrid learning environment. I'll be discussing each of these 5 steps in greater detail next. So first of all, know your ELLs. Secondly, identify the language or skills students need in the lesson. Third, plan the lesson. Fourth, select and develop appropriate materials. And lastly, teach a lesson, adapting scaffolding and materials as needed. So for the first step, uh, which is or getting to know your ELLs, you might have in your school templates that you use to fill out and get some background information on each ELL student. But here's a link to a virtual template in Google Slides. So you can use these templates to fill in information on your ELLs and share with your colleagues working with ELL students. Second step in developing scaffolded lessons is to analyze the language demands of the academic task and text that you're planning to include in your lesson. So identify areas where ELLs may need explicit background instruction prior to the lesson, that pre-teaching we mentioned earlier. And then also consider the language demands for students in terms of vocabulary, sentence, and discourse levels, and what vocabulary might be challenging for ELLs, what sentences might be confusing or difficult to deconstruct in the text, and how the text or activity is organized might also be posing a challenge for ELLs. So in that book that Katie showed early in this presentation, chapters 5 and 6 in the Unlocking English Learners Potential book will offer explanations of the types of language demands that can be challenging for ELLs and how to respond to these challenges in your instruction. Step 2 includes a tool that you can use to analyze a text that you plan to use with your students. And this tool is called the Checklist for Increasing Academic Language Awareness and can be found on page 6 of your tools packet. So the tools packet was that blue screen that Katie had shown earlier. All of these tools that we're mentioning here link back to that same left-hand side of that site, that Padlet. So then once you've analyzed your lesson to identify possible challenges for ELLs, you can begin to plan for the particular scaffolds that you will use in the lesson to meet the needs of your ELLs. So once again, it's important to remember that not all ELLs will require the same scaffold. So step 3, suggested scaffolds at each proficiency level, is a list of recommended scaffolds for ELLs by proficiency level, as well as scaffolds that will benefit ELLs at all levels. So knowing the types of scaffolds that might be appropriate for different proficiency levels and tasks can be a challenge. So please be sure to share this tool with colleagues and you can collaborate together with that. So then once you've planned your lesson, you can begin selecting and developing materials. Step 4, the ELL materials checklist, which can be found on in the tools packet again, includes two checklists that you might find useful for this process. So sometimes the thought of preparing scaffolded materials for every lesson can seem daunting, especially if you're trying to scaffold for ELLs. But I encourage you to start with just one lesson or unit and get the feel for really what seems effective in supporting your ELLs and what might be less effective. And it can also be very helpful to collaborate with your colleagues developing the scaffold materials. So what systems are in place to easily share resources? So ELL teachers and school librarians would be a great resource for finding these new materials. And again, that Ms. Park site as well. And lastly, the final step in the scaffolding process is to actually teach a lesson. And step 5 is a checklist that you can use to make sure that you have completed all the steps in planning for a scaffolded lesson. So all of the tools in the 5-step framework for scaffolding instruction, again, are available in the tools packet, which I've linked again here. It's the same link as Katie had shown earlier, and that It's on the left side of that blue screen, all the different tools. You could see the Padlet. So that brings us to wrapping up at this point. Now that you've had a chance to consider some of these L supports and scaffolds, which scaffolds would you like to try? Which ones would you incorporate in distance or hybrid classrooms specifically? And consider setting up a goal for yourself around your use of scaffolds for ELLs. So does anyone want to share your thoughts as to what you'd like to try or what you have tried and might be adjusting?
I really like that virtual word wall. I think that regardless of whether you're in person or you're, utilizing distance or hybrid learning, something like that, a tool like that, I feel like, again, even when we return to in-person learning, that is a really helpful, alternative to traditional word walls that we might have. Again, because it has that element of adding the access to the audio, the picture, the definition, and it could even be something, a tool like that, a teacher could make a copy for each student. So then they could kind of add to it, and it can be kind of a two-way collaborative tool that is built throughout a unit or built throughout a class. And the students could then add their own audio. They can add their own maybe new words that they find, and build their own kind of either dictionary or virtual word wall. So I think that a tool like that can be helpful moving forward, regardless of, the mode of instructional delivery.
So again, just including, we are all teachers of ELLs, regardless of whether or not specifically referred to as an L teacher. We all teach students, and not only that that are ELLs, but not only that, all of these L resources are really about supporting students that are having difficulty, in the case of ELLs with the language, but any of your struggling students would benefit from all of these scaffolds and resources and tools and um, methods as well. So it doesn't just apply to L. It applies to L in terms of the language, but it applies to all students, any that might need additional supports, as well as any students with disabilities that could benefit from all of these resources. Okay, so again, what we went through in this webinar is describing the challenge opportunities for ELLs during distance and hybrid learning, then defining scaffolding for ELLs. Then we explored strategies for scaffolding tasks for ELLs. And lastly, we applied the 5-step framework to scaffold content instruction for ELLs in distance and hybrid learning environments. So we hope this was helpful for you, and we would like you to ask that you fill out a quick survey. It is needed for the TRLE grant feedback. And Katie, would you drop that link into chat? And you'll also be emailed a link to the survey after we conclude this. So thank you for joining us. We hope this was helpful.